What happens when a seasoned British talk show host meets Hollywood royalty gone rogue? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with Jane Moore on Loose Women and everything goes spectacularly wrong. This isn't your typical celebrity chat. This is an absolute car crash that had viewers glued to their screens and social media in complete meltdown. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle walked onto the Loose Women set last night. What was supposed to be a promotional appearance for her latest Netflix project quickly transformed into one of the most explosive confrontations in British television history. Jane Moore, never one to shy away from difficult questions, had clearly come prepared for battle, and Meghan, well, let's just say she wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. The warning signs were there from the very beginning. As Meghan settled into her chair, adjusting her cream-colored blazer with that practiced Hollywood smile, Jane's opening remarks carried an edge that cut through the studio's carefully orchestrated atmosphere like a knife through butter. "Meghan, lovely to have you back on British television," Jane began, her tone deceptively sweet, but with an underlying sharpness that anyone familiar with her interviewing style would recognize immediately. "Though I have to say, your last few appearances on British soil have been rather memorable, haven't they?" The smile on Meghan's face flickered for just a moment, so brief that viewers at home might have missed it, but the studio audience caught it. The collective intake of breath was audible even through the television microphones. "Jane, it's wonderful to be here," Meghan replied, her American accent crisp and measured. "I've always appreciated the directness of British media. It certainly keeps you on your toes." But Jane wasn't done with her opening salvo. Leaning forward slightly, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair catching the studio lights, she continued, "Speaking of being on your toes, you've been quite vocal recently about privacy and media intrusion. Yet here you are, promoting another Netflix project, courting the very attention you claim to despise. Don't you find that just a tiny bit contradictory?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Meghan's media-trained composure remained intact, but those watching closely could see her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Her hands, previously relaxed on her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. "I think there's a significant difference between choosing to share your story on your own terms and having false narratives created about you," Meghan responded, her voice still controlled but with a new edge creeping in. "When you've been misrepresented for years, sometimes the only way to set the record straight is to tell your truth." "Your truth," Jane repeated, emphasizing the possessive pronoun with surgical precision. "That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Suggests there might be other truths out there, other versions of events that perhaps don't align with yours?" The other panelists, Nadia Sawalha, Kay Adams, and Linda Robson, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't the gentle promotional chat they'd been briefed to expect. Jane Moore was in full investigative journalist mode, and Meghan Markle was about to discover that Loose Women wasn't going to be the friendly platform she'd anticipated. "Jane, I think you're misunderstanding the concept of personal truth," Meghan shot back, her California composure beginning to show hairline cracks. "When someone attacks your character, your family, your very existence in the most public ways possible, speaking your truth isn't creating alternative facts, it's survival." "Survival?" Jane's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "That's quite a strong word for someone who's managed to secure multi-million-dollar deals with Netflix and Spotify, isn't it? I mean, let's be honest here. You've hardly been struggling in obscurity, have you?" The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't the polished, predictable celebrity interview they'd expected. This was real conflict, unfolding in real time, with two formidable women who clearly had no intention of backing down. Meghan's laugh was sharp and brittle. "You know what, Jane? This is exactly what I'm talking about. The assumption that because I've been successful, I can't have experienced genuine hardship or trauma. The idea that financial success somehow invalidates emotional pain or mental health struggles. But surely, Jane pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the warning signals flashing around her, you have to acknowledge that your platform, your wealth, your influence, gives you opportunities that most people dealing with similar issues simply don't have. You can't expect sympathy from working mothers struggling to put food on the table when you're complaining from your Montecito mansion, can you? The question landed like a slap across the face. Meghan's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Just a fraction, but enough for everyone in the studio to see it. Her eyes flashed with something dangerous. Anger, frustration, perhaps even hurt. That's incredibly patronizing, Jane, Meghan said, her voice dropping to a lower register that somehow made her words more menacing than if she'd shouted. You're essentially saying that because I'm successful, my experiences don't matter. That because I have money, I'm not allowed to speak about injustice, racism, or mental health struggles. Jane Moore, to her credit, didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed energized by the pushback. I'm not saying your experiences don't matter, Meghan. I'm questioning whether constantly rehashing them in public, for profit, is the most productive way forward. At what point does sharing your story become exploiting your story? The accusation hung between them like a live wire, crackling with tension. Meghan's face had gone very pale, except for two bright spots of color on her cheeks. Her hands were no longer gripping the chair arms, they were clenched into fists. Exploiting? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow more threatening than a scream. You think talking about the racism I experienced, the suicidal thoughts I had, the lack of support I received, you think that's exploitation? I think, Jane replied, with the kind of calm that only comes from years of handling difficult interviews, that there's a difference between raising awareness and repeatedly monetizing trauma, and I think most of our viewers are smart enough to spot the difference. But what happened next would prove that Jane Moore had finally pushed too far. The silence that followed Jane's accusation was deafening. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Meghan Markle simply stared at her host, her chest rising and falling with barely controlled breathing. The studio cameras caught every micro-expression, the twitch of her left eye, the way her nostrils flared slightly, the dangerous stillness that preceded the storm. Monetizing trauma? Meghan's voice was ice-cold now, each word delivered with surgical precision. Are you fucking serious right now, Jane? The collective gasp from the audience was audible even through the television speakers. Swearing on daytime British television was rare enough, but this felt different. This felt like a declaration of war. The other panelists looked like deer caught in headlights, Nadia Sawalha's mouth literally hanging open. Jane Moore, however, didn't even blink. If anything, she leaned forward with renewed interest, like a predator sensing wounded prey. Well, that's certainly one way to deflect the question. But yes, Meghan, I am serious. When you're paid millions to discuss your family struggles on Netflix, when every interview comes with a price tag, when trauma becomes your brand, what else would you call it? My brand? Meghan's laugh was harsh and brittle. You think racism is my brand? You think contemplating suicide, because of the relentless harassment I received from your precious British press, is something I chose as a marketing strategy? I think, Jane replied with infuriating calm, that you've made a very comfortable living discussing these topics, and I think it's fair to ask whether constantly revisiting them serves any purpose beyond keeping you in the headlines and your bank account healthy. The accusation hit its mark. Meghan's composure, already hanging by a thread, finally snapped completely. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the studio floor with an ear-splitting screech that made everyone wince. You know what, Jane? You're exactly what's wrong with this country's media, Meghan snarled, her American accent becoming more pronounced as her anger intensified. You sit there, in your privileged position, having never experienced an ounce of the discrimination I faced, and you have the audacity to question my motives for speaking out. Jane remained seated, but her body language shifted into full confrontation mode. Privileged position? I'm sorry, but wasn't it you who married into the most privileged family in Britain? Wasn't it you who had a fairy tale wedding watched by billions? And now you're lecturing me about privilege? That fairy tale was a nightmare, Meghan shot back, her voice rising to a near shout. Every single day I was in that institution, I was dying inside. The isolation, the racism from your tabloids, the complete lack of support, and you want to reduce all of that to privilege? But you stayed long enough to secure your titles, didn't you? Jane's voice remained maddeningly calm, which only seemed to fuel Meghan's rage further. Long enough to benefit from the association, long enough to build a brand around being royal before you decided being royal wasn't for you. Kay Adams finally found her voice, attempting to de-escalate the situation. Ladies, perhaps we should take a breath here and— No! Meghan whirled around to face her. I'm tired of taking a breath. I'm tired of being told to stay quiet, to be gracious, to turn the other cheek while people like her— She jabbed a finger toward Jane. Tear me apart for having the nerve to survive and tell my story. Jane stood up slowly, finally matching Meghan's energy level. Nobody's tearing you apart, Meghan. We're asking legitimate questions about your choices and your narratives. Questions that apparently you can't handle without resorting to profanity and emotional outbursts. Emotional outbursts? Meghan's voice cracked with incredulity. I'm having an emotional outburst because I'm defending myself against accusations that I'm somehow profiting from my own trauma? How the hell else am I supposed to react? The studio was electric with tension now. The audience sat in stunned silence, some holding their phones up to record what was clearly going to become viral content within hours. The other panelists looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. You could react with grace, Jane suggested, her tone now carrying just a hint of condescension. You could acknowledge that perhaps, just perhaps, some of the criticism you receive isn't rooted in racism or misogyny, but in genuine concerns about consistency and authenticity. That was the final straw. Meghan's face went white with fury, her hands shaking as she pointed directly at Jane. Grace? You want me to show grace to someone who just accused me of exploiting my own mental health struggles for money? Someone who's essentially calling me a liar about the racism I experienced? I never called you a liar, Jane protested, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. You didn't have to say the word, Meghan spat. It's been the subtext of every single question you've asked. The implication that I'm exaggerating, that I'm playing the victim, that I'm somehow manipulating public sympathy for personal gain. Well, fuck that. And fuck this interview. The profanity hung in the air like a smoking gun. Jane Moore's carefully constructed composure finally showed its first real crack, her eyes widening slightly at the unexpected vehemence of the attack. Meghan, there's no need for— There's every need, Meghan interrupted, her voice now carrying across the entire studio. You've spent the last 15 minutes systematically trying to undermine everything I've said, questioning my motives, my integrity, my right to speak about my own experiences. And you want me to sit here quietly and take it? Linda Robson, clearly uncomfortable, attempted to interject. Perhaps we could discuss the Netflix project instead. No, Linda. Meghan cut her off without even looking in her direction. I'm done pretending this is a normal interview. This is an ambush, and I should have seen it coming the moment I stepped foot back in this country. Jane finally found her fighting stance again, her jaw set with determination. An ambush? Or accountability? There's a difference, Meghan, though I understand why you might struggle to tell them apart. The insult landed like a physical blow. Meghan's face flushed red with rage, and for a moment it looked like she might actually lunge across the coffee table separating them. The tension in the studio was so thick it was almost suffocating. Accountability? Meghan's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than her earlier shouting. You want to talk about accountability? How about the accountability of a media that drove me to the brink of suicide? How about the accountability of a system that protected my abusers while painting me as the villain? But Jane Moore wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when she could sense her moment of victory approaching. Accountability, Jane repeated, her voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. Yes, let's talk about that. You mentioned being driven to the brink. But what about your accountability to the family you married into? What about your accountability to the staff members you allegedly bullied? What about your accountability to the British public who welcomed you with open arms before you decided we weren't good enough for you? The accusations hit Meghan like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. Her face cycled through emotions so quickly it was almost dizzying: shock, hurt, rage, and something that looked dangerously close to desperation. Staff I bullied? Meghan's voice was shaking now, but whether from anger or something deeper was impossible to tell. That's a fucking lie, and you know it. Those allegations were investigated and found to be, were they? Jane interrupted, her journalist instincts now in full predator mode. Because from what I recall, the palace never released the findings of that investigation. Funny how things work out, isn't it? How convenient that the results remain sealed. The audience was completely transfixed now. Some were recording on their phones, others had their hands pressed to their mouths in shock. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a public execution being broadcast live on daytime television. Meghan took a step closer to Jane, her hands balled into fists at her sides. You want to know what's convenient, Jane? What's convenient is how you and your colleagues in the British press can spread lies and rumors with impunity, hide behind sources close to the palace, and destroy people's lives without ever having to face consequences. Sources that have proven remarkably reliable over the years, Jane shot back. Sources that were right about your father's staged photographs, right about your half-sister's warnings, right about the rift with Catherine. At what point do you stop blaming the messenger and start looking in the mirror? That was it. That was the moment Meghan Markle completely lost control. "Fuck you!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the studio with such force that several audience members actually jumped in their seats. "Fuck you and your racist, misogynistic piece of shit excuse for journalism. You've made a career out of tearing down women, especially women of color, and I'm sick of pretending otherwise." The entire studio fell into stunned silence. Even Jane Moore, for all her experience with difficult interviews, looked genuinely shocked by the ferocity of the outburst. The other panelists sat frozen, clearly wishing they were anywhere else in the world. But Jane recovered quickly, her journalistic instincts kicking back in. "Racist? Meghan, I've been nothing but professional. If asking difficult questions is racist, then perhaps the problem isn't with the questions, but with your ability to answer them." "Professional?" Meghan laughed. But there was no humor in it, only bitter, raw pain. "You call this professional? Ambushing me with bullying allegations, questioning whether my trauma is real, suggesting I'm a gold digger who only stayed in the royal family long enough to cash in. That's your idea of professionalism? I call it journalism," Jane replied coolly. "The kind that asks the questions your American media friends are too starstruck to ask." Meghan was trembling now, her entire body vibrating with rage and hurt. "You know what the real tragedy is, Jane? Women like you are exactly why women like me can't succeed in this country. You tear us down, you question our motives, you make us prove our worthiness over and over again, and then when we finally break, you point to our breakdown as evidence that you were right all along." "Or," Jane countered, her voice sharp as a blade, "women like you come into situations expecting special treatment, expecting to be above criticism, and when the real world doesn't bend to your will, you cry racism and sexism, instead of taking responsibility for your choices." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. For a moment, Meghan stood perfectly still, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made several people in the front row lean back in their chairs. Then, without warning, she reached for her microphone pack and ripped it off her dress with such violence that the wireless transmitter clattered across the studio floor. "I'm done," she said, her voice now deadly calm, in a way that was somehow more frightening than her earlier screaming. I'm done with this interview, I'm done with this show, and I'm done with this entire fucking country. Nadia Sawalha finally found her voice, making one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Meghan, please, let's just take a moment to... No, Nadia. Meghan cut her off without even glancing in her direction. There's nothing left to say. Jane has made it crystal clear what she thinks of me, and I've made it crystal clear what I think of her brand of journalism. She turned back to Jane, who was still sitting in her chair, watching the meltdown with what could only be described as professional satisfaction. You know what, Jane? You got exactly what you wanted. You got your viral moment, your dramatic confrontation, your proof that the difficult American just can't handle proper British scrutiny. Congratulations. Jane opened her mouth to respond, but Meghan wasn't finished. But here's what you didn't get, she continued, her voice building to a crescendo. You didn't get the truth. You didn't get justice. And you sure as hell didn't get a woman who's going to sit quietly while you and your colleagues continue to spread lies about her family, her character, and her mental health. With that, Meghan Markle turned on her heel and began walking toward the studio exit, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots, in the absolute silence that had fallen over the set. Meghan, you can't just walk out in the middle of a live broadcast, Jane called after her, finally showing some cracks in her composure. Meghan paused at the edge of the set and turned back one final time, her face a mask of cold fury and wounded dignity. Watch me, she said simply, and with that, she disappeared through the studio doors, leaving behind a set full of shocked faces, a host who looked like she'd just survived a car crash, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about television moments of the year. Jane Moore sat in stunned silence for several seconds, clearly trying to process what had just happened. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the aftermath. Finally, she turned to face the main camera, her professional mask slipping back into place with visible effort. Well, she said, her voice slightly hoarse from the confrontation, I think that tells you everything you need to know about Meghan Markle's ability to handle legitimate criticism. The studio audience remained silent, still processing the explosive confrontation they'd just witnessed. The other panelists looked shell-shocked, clearly struggling to figure out how to continue with the show after what had just transpired. As the cameras finally cut to commercial, the sound of Meghan Markle's car doors slamming could be heard echoing through the studio parking lot, followed by the screech of tires as she made her escape from what would go down as one of the most catastrophic celebrity interviews in British television history. The aftermath would dominate social media for weeks, with clips of the confrontation racking up millions of views and sparking countless debates about media treatment, accountability, and the price of fame. But in that moment, all that remained was the echo of two women who had pushed each other past the point of no return, and the unmistakable sense that this was a battle neither of them had truly won.